Caleb, a soldier with eyes hollowed by war, stood at a gas station, autumn chill in the air. A frail girl clutching a worn doll stumbled, dropping a note, "Dad, come home." He never knew he had a child. In that moment, home wasn't just a place, it was a truth he could no longer run from. That fall afternoon, the sky was stretched in a pale blue, thin as an old scarf that had been through a whole day of dry wind. Caleb pulled his beat-up pickup into the gas station off the highway, the roof over the pump stained with rust, its shadow spilling long across the cracked gray pavement. He slid the nozzle into the tank and listened to the gas running down into metal, steady, sure. The smell of fuel mixed with the scent of dry maple leaves from the row of trees along the road, folding into the cold air so that his breath came out in short white puffs. Out on the highway that cut through town, a few cars drifted by in the last light of the day. Just as he twisted the handle to stop the pump, his eyes, used to the slow rhythm of this place, caught something that didn't belong. A small figure, half lost in the gray of the road and the gold of fallen leaves, was moving toward him. At first, it was just a shape, too small to guess the age, the gender. But as the distance closed, the picture sharpened, a little girl, hair tangled across her face, wearing a worn-out gray sweater, clutching a porcelain doll with one cheek cracked. Each step she took wasn't so much walking as it was fighting, her small feet barely lifting, her shoulders hunched to keep warm, her body tilted against the push of the autumn wind. The wind swept into the station lot, circling a few dead leaves around Caleb's old combat boots. He straightened, left the gas cap hanging. No call, no question. Just the kind of silence that feels tight in your chest, his eyes fixed on her like every step she took was a thin thread holding her here. She slowed when she was just a few yards away. Her small hands were locked around the doll, knuckles white, the veins showing under thin skin, pressing it tight to her chest like it was the only thing she had left. The wind lifted her sweater hem, showing the pale curve of her neck under the slant of the evening sun. And then, without warning, her body gave out. No cry, no flinch, she crumpled onto the cold paving stones. The sound of her hitting the ground was dry, sharp, cutting through the space where only the wind and the squeak of the store's old door had been. Caleb was on her in a few steps, dropping to one knee. The cold from her body bled into his hands as he cupped her head and shoulders. Under his fingers, he felt each small bone, the gaps where muscle should have been, so light he was afraid too much pressure might break her. In that moment, there was something more than shock, more than pity, a small, fragile spark of joy. The kind you feel when you realize you can still move, still reach out, still catch someone before they fall. Not happiness exactly, but the stir of an old instinct he knew well, to protect. He pulled her knit cap back into place, a thoughtless but certain gesture. The wind spun around them again, bringing with it the smell of gas and damp earth, but Caleb didn't care. His eyes stayed on her face, cracked lips, eyebrows drawn, and somewhere deep in his chest, a decision started to settle in. Not the kind that makes a man a hero. The kind a man makes when he's known loss, and knows that if you want to keep the small moments, like the relief of hearing someone still breathe, you stand between them and whatever could take them away. He leaned lower, sliding one arm under her back, lifting her as if she were something you couldn't replace. Her tangled hair brushed his sleeve, light as a breath. That flicker of joy was no longer alone, it carried a deeper need. To keep this moment, and this life, safe. Across the lot, leaves kept turning in the wind, and the last of the day's light poured out over the road. Caleb rose, holding her close, his shoulders angling forward to shield her from the cold. In his eyes, the rest of the world faded, all that mattered was the distance from here to somewhere safe. And he knew, once he started walking, he wouldn't stop halfway, not for this girl, not for anyone whose life he'd taken into his arms. The sound of his first step on the pavement wasn't just rubber hitting concrete. It was a quiet promise, etched deeper than words, whatever waited ahead, he'd stand against it, as long as he could keep the fragile warmth resting in his arms. The girl only managed a few more steps before her knees buckled, her hands still clamped tight around the porcelain doll. Caleb saw her whole body pitch forward, like a sapling pushed over by an autumn gust. The only sounds were the scrape of her sweater against the pavement and the wind whistling through an old, faded sign swinging on a rusted pole. No scream, no moan, just a collapse so quiet it didn't seem real. He moved on instinct. 2 long strides and he was there, dropping hard to one knee, sliding his hand behind her neck to catch her. The cold from her body seeped through the thin fabric, right into his bones. Her tangled hair brushed his sleeve, dry and light, like it hadn't been washed in days. He pressed his other hand against her back, feeling the stutter of her breath, short, weak, so faint he had to focus just to notice it. No smell of blood, but the dry sweat and road dust on her skin told him this wasn't the first time she'd been out in the wind and cold. The wind curled around his legs, spinning brittle yellow leaves across the girl's face. Caleb bent lower, using his body as a shield. In that moment, the distant rumble of a truck on the highway, the squeak of the store's door, none of it reached inside the small circle where it was just him and her. He didn't call out for anyone. Instead, he shifted his grip so her whole frame fit in his arms, her head turned toward his chest, as if his warmth might pull her back. His own breathing slowed and deepened, not just to steady himself, but so if she could feel anything at all, she could hold on to it. A car rolled past, tires crunching over gravel. The driver glanced over, then kept going. Caleb wasn't surprised. He'd seen that before, in war zones, in crowded streets, how people look away when something doesn't touch them directly. But for him, the silence and the cold weight in his arms cut straight to the bone. He held her tighter, not to restrain, but as a quiet promise to himself, this child wasn't going to be left here, forgotten between a gas station and an autumn wind. Faces he'd lost before. People who hadn't made it out in time, flashed in his mind, stacking one over another. He knew this girl's face wouldn't be added to that list. His breath came heavier as he shifted, bracing one knee, then standing. She weighed almost nothing, but it felt like carrying something far heavier than her small, thin frame, a whole story he didn't know yet. He scanned the lot. The sky was already stretching shadows across the ground, the sun went down earlier this time of year. The weak light washed everything in bronze and gray. Above, the old sign kept rattling in the wind, making that dry, hollow sound, like a reminder nothing here was built to last. Caleb headed for his pickup, his steps long but steady. He kept his breathing even, careful not to jostle her. His boots thudded on the pavement, then crunched over gravel, blending with the rustle of leaves. In her arms, the doll was still pressed tight, its cracked cheek a white slash across the porcelain. He glanced down. Her thin fingers were still curled, even unconscious, as if afraid someone might take it. That grip told him all he needed to know, there were things in her world she valued more than herself. He opened the passenger door, eased her onto the seat, keeping a hand under her neck so her head wouldn't loll. When he closed the door, his eyes caught his own reflection in the glass, drawn, tense, and carrying a kind of resolve he hadn't seen in himself since leaving the service. Circling to the driver's side, he started the engine. The sound was warm, steady, like the signal for something you couldn't turn back from. The wind still slipped through the gap between the roof and the old sign outside, but inside the cab, Caleb felt the heat of a mission he'd just accepted. Not an order from a commander, this came from deep inside, where that small spark of joy at still being able to protect had hardened into something unshakable. He gripped the wheel, glanced at the passenger seat. She was still, the doll still in her arms, the wind outside still testing every intention. Caleb pressed the gas, pulling the truck away from the station, leaving behind the dry rattle of that old sign and the cold pavement where a silent promise had just been made. The truck's tires crunched over the gravel before stopping in a small lot, just a few open spaces in front of a low red brick building. A faded blue sign hung over the awning, Glenville Community Clinic. Caleb shut off the engine. The hum faded, leaving only the wind curling around the corner of the street and the soft whoosh of the clinic's automatic glass doors opening and closing. He came around to the passenger side and opened the door. The girl was still curled up, head tilted, lips dry and cracked, arms locked around the porcelain doll like she'd never let go. Caleb slid one arm under her back, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her. She was light as a bundle of dry kindling, light enough to worry you, but with that brittle feel that made you think she could snap if you weren't careful. The glass doors parted, and a wave of warm air mixed with the sharp scent of antiseptic met them. Inside, the cold fluorescent light spilled over a white tile floor that had yellowed in spots, cream-colored walls showing patches of old damp. The reception desk was empty, the only sound came from a pen scratching in an open office behind it. From that doorway stepped a middle-aged woman, gray-streaked hair pulled back, glasses low on her nose, a name tag on her white coat, Ruth Miller, RN. Her eyes moved from Caleb to the small shape in his arms. Her face changed, not with surprise, but with the kind of recognition you don't want to have. "Room 3, she said quietly, voice low but firm, and turned to lead the way. Caleb followed, his old combat boots thudding against the floor, the sound mixing with the whistle of wind in the narrow hallway. Room 3 was small, with a low ceiling. A hospital bed with a thin white sheet, a tall metal cabinet against the wall. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, mixed with the faint must of laundry not quite dry. Caleb set the girl down, slid a flat pillow under her head. Ruth moved in, quick and practiced, fingers on her wrist for a pulse, leaning close to feel her breath. Under the light, shadows pooled deep at the corners of her eyes as her brow tightened. "No external injuries," Ruth said, voice low, as if she didn't want to break the stillness in the room. "But, severe malnutrition. Dehydration. Slow reflexes, dry skin. Signs of long-term neglect." Caleb stood by the bed, eyes fixed on the girl's face. The words she used, malnourished, dehydrated, neglected, he'd heard them before in refugee camps, war zones. In those places, the reasons were obvious: homes lost, land gone, fighting everywhere. But here, in a town with a church, a school, a main street, those words hit harder, sharper. Ruth opened the metal cabinet, pulled out a small 4-bag, hung it beside the bed. Her hands moved without wasted motion, threading the tubing, sliding the needle into the back of the girl's hand. She didn't wake, just flinched slightly, still holding tight to her doll. Caleb leaned down, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. It wasn't enough to drive the cold out of her body, but it was a line between her and the chill of the room. Under the pale light, Ruth checked her again, lifting an eyelid, pressing a palm to her forehead. "Temps low," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She jotted a note in the chart, her handwriting angled and quick. Caleb stayed silent, hands clasped in front of him. This wasn't a moment for words. Just listening, to the pen on paper, the steady drip from the 4. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the blue curtain at the window. After a long pause, Ruth looked up and met his eyes. She didn't need to say it, he already understood. This wasn't a skipped meal or a day without water. This was weeks, maybe months, of being left to fend for herself. He gave a small nod. Inside, that first fragile spark, the relief of catching someone before they fell, was now feeding a different fire, the will to protect. Not just to get her through tonight, but to make sure she never ended up here again. Ruth set her stethoscope down, poured warm water into a white mug, and placed it near Caleb. "When she wakes, small sips," she said, then quietly closed the door behind her. Caleb pulled a plastic chair close to the bed and sat. His hand rested lightly on the blanket's edge, not touching her, but close enough that if she moved, she'd know someone was there. He glanced up at the ceiling, the light casting spiderweb cracks in the plaster. In his head, the plan was already taking shape: who to talk to, what to ask, and which answers he was ready to push back against if they didn't keep her safe. Outside, the town was still caught in an autumn afternoon. But here, in this worn little room, a new front line had formed. No gunfire, no smoke, just a life that had been placed in his hands. And once taken, he knew he wouldn't step back. Caleb sat at the edge of the bed for a long while, listening only to the steady drip of the floor and the wind curling through the hallway outside. The fluorescent light cast a cold, pale wash over the girl's face, making her cracked lips look even paler. He leaned in, lowering his line of sight so he could see her more clearly. "I have to go home," her voice was thin as a thread, trembling halfway through. "Aunt will be mad." Caleb almost had to hold his breath to catch it all. It wasn't a plea, and it wasn't a cry for help. It was something memorized, drilled into her enough times to become instinct, a little mantra to keep herself safe from something worse. He looked into her eyes. They weren't searching for his, but fixed on the small, fogged-up window. Outside, the sky was a dull autumn gray, the maples trembling in the wind. It was the kind of look you see when someone's scanning for an escape, or clinging to an empty space that feels safer than where they are. He didn't press her. In the service, he'd learned there are moments where silence does more than any question. He pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, then stayed where he was, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her. She swallowed lightly, eyes still locked on the window. Moisture on the glass had gathered into thin trails, sliding down slow. A yellow leaf drifted in from somewhere, tapped the glass, shivered there for a beat, then fell out of sight. Caleb noticed her eyelids shift slightly, like she'd seen it too, but she didn't turn her head. Under the blanket, her small hand tightened on the doll. The cracked porcelain cheek caught the light, drawing a fine white line. Her hand was dry and rough, nails chipped, a few fingers split at the corners. Not the hands of a child who'd been cared for, these were hands used to cold, to holding on to something for hours at a time. Outside, the wind changed, slipping through the door frame, carrying the smell of damp leaves. Caleb took a slow breath, not to steady himself, but to measure the gap between what she'd just said and what he needed to do. "Aunt will be mad." The words held both caution and a kind of surrender that had settled in deep. Ruth came in quietly, her eyes moving from Caleb to the girl. She set a small tray on the bedside table, a cup of warm water, a few slices of white bread. "When she's fully awake, water first, then a little food," she said, her tone softer than usual. Caleb nodded, silent, and Ruth left the way she came. He slid his chair a little closer, still keeping a space between his hand and the bed. "I'm here," he said, just loud enough for it to stay in the room. The girl didn't respond, only blinked slowly. After a moment, her gaze shifted from the window to the empty space in front of her. She still didn't look directly at him, but he caught the difference, the tightness in her eyes easing, like a rope loosening just a bit. He tilted his head, trying to take in that small change. He didn't add any more words, just let his presence sit there without demands. She turned back toward the window. Outside, the sky was darker now, the streetlights starting to glow, their pale yellow reflecting in the glass. The town was settling into the slow rhythm of an autumn evening, but in this room, time had stopped, just the two of them, and things that couldn't yet be spoken. Caleb knew in situations like this, actions mattered more than promises. "Aunt will be mad" wasn't just a warning for her, it was a warning for anyone who thought about stepping in. He'd heard versions of that sentence in other corners of the world, and it always meant something bigger was waiting ahead. He glanced down at his hands. The same hands that had gripped a rifle, the same hands that had held a buddy's life on the battlefield. Now they rested on his knees, patient, waiting for the moment they'd be needed. The urge to protect was growing, steady and certain, like rain soaking into the ground, quiet, but unstoppable. The girl shifted under the blanket, her shoulders curling in for warmth. Caleb reached over, adjusted the four so the tubing didn't pull, then tugged the blanket higher. Her eyes flicked toward him, quick, but enough for him to see it. There wasn't just caution in them, but the faint outline of a question. "Will you stay?" He answered without speaking, by sitting up straight, angling his back toward the window to block the draft, keeping his eyes on her. A silent promise, no matter if Aunt got mad, no matter how messy it got ahead, he'd be the one standing in the way. Out in the hall, footsteps faded. The room settled back into quiet. Caleb realized he was stepping into a different kind of fight. Not against an enemy with a weapon, but against walls built around a child. And he knew breaking through them would take more than strength. It would take time, patience, and keeping this fire lit until "Aunt will be mad" was no longer the thing she feared most. When the door closed behind Ruth, the room settled into that heavy kind of silence you only get under fluorescent lights. Caleb sat down in the wooden chair against the wall, feeling the cold, hard surface under his palm as he braced on the edge. The slow drip of the four mixed with the sound of wind moving through the hallway, forming a rhythm that wasn't rushed, but didn't feel reassuring either. The girl lay on her side, facing the wall, as if she wanted to disappear into the faded paint. Under the blanket, her arms stayed locked around the doll, her chin resting on its matted plastic hair. Caleb couldn't see her face, just the narrow line of her back and the faint rise and fall of her breathing. Weak as it was, it held steady, like a small pulse trying to keep pace against the cold air pressing in from all sides. He leaned back a little but kept his eyes on her. The light caught on the fuzzy yarn of the hat pulled over her head. It had stretched out, sagging down over half her ear, the edge curled into a crooked line. Maybe it had once fit right, once been warmer. Now it was just a thin layer holding on to the last bit of heat. Caleb leaned forward, moving slow so he wouldn't startle her. His fingers brushed the edge of the hat, tugging it up just enough to clear her eyes, then smoothing the twisted fold. It was a simple thing, but as he did it, he realized his hands were warming, not from the air in the room, but from the sense that he was setting something right for someone who needed it. When his hand left the hat, he stayed where he was, letting that small bit of warmth carry. In the service, he'd adjusted helmet straps for buddies, pulled up collars against the desert wind, tightened pack straps before a long night. Those weren't big acts, but they told the other person, "I'm here, I've got you." This was no different, only this time, it wasn't a fellow soldier, it was a child. She didn't turn toward him, but her shoulders seemed to ease a little. Caleb leaned back, lacing his fingers, his thumb rubbing over the other the way it always did when he was weighing something. In the dim light, he noticed everything, the frayed stitching on the blanket's edge, the shaky shadow of a maple tree on the wall through the fogged window, the faint rattle of glass when the wind shifted. He didn't try to break the quiet. At his age, with what he'd been through, he knew some lines can't be tied with words. They're built from being there, from someone knowing they're not alone, even in a small room with peeling paint. He shifted his feet on the floor, positioning himself so he could stand in a second if she needed him. But he didn't leave. His eyes followed the knit hat down to the bit of tangled hair at her neck. A few strands caught in the yarn, glinting faintly under the light. He thought about the hands that might have once smoothed that hair, the warmth of a mother, and the space left behind when those hands were gone. Outside, a sudden gust rattled the maples, sending leaves skittering. She drew her neck in, clutching the doll tighter. Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, angling his body toward the bed, not too close, not crowding, but close enough that if she opened her eyes, he'd be in her line of sight. He sat like that, feeling the minutes pass slow. Every drip from the four felt like a quiet marker, he'd be here until her breathing steadied, until her hands eased their grip on the doll, until her eyes stopped searching the fogged window for a way out. Outside, the streetlights came on, throwing soft gold through the thin curtain, stretching across the wall in long lines. Caleb knew the night would pass in this quiet watch. He'd spent plenty of nights awake before, but never one where the thing he was guarding felt this fragile, a bit of warmth, a small breath, and the chance to grow trust from something as small as a gesture. And in that moment, with the cold light above and the wind pushing at the windows, he understood, sometimes protecting someone isn't about building a wall. Sometimes it's about straightening a knit hat so the person wearing it knows, they're not alone. Caleb stayed where he was, hands clasped, eyes following the girl's smallest movements. The fluorescent light caught the pale of her skin, the stray strands of hair spilling onto the pillow. Then, almost without warning, she shifted slightly. Not enough to turn toward him, just enough for her eyes to glance his way. It was the kind of look that felt like a thin thread stretched between them. No longer than a breath, not deep enough to reach the bottom, but no longer the avoidance from before. He didn't move in or ask anything. Experience had taught him that moments like this vanish if you try to grab hold. He let it come and go like a draft slipping through a door, brief, cool, but enough to know something had opened, even if just a crack. He dropped his eyes, pretending to straighten the blanket. While he did, he listened to her breathing, still thin, but less hurried. Maybe it was coincidence, but Caleb chose to believe that, for that brief instant, she'd let him into the narrow world she was living in. Outside the window, maple branches swayed under the pale yellow of the streetlights. A stronger gust sent a few leaves spinning past the glass, their shadows running across the wall. Caleb stayed still, watching the shapes slide out of sight, realizing he was hoping to catch that glance again. In the army, he'd learned to memorize terrain in minutes. Now, he realized he was doing the same with her face, remembering the shape of her eyes when they looked over, the length of her lashes, the way the light caught in her pupils. Small details, but proof of what he'd just been given, a fragile permission. She turned back toward the wall, hugging the doll closer. But the space between them had shifted, not in feet, but in meaning. Caleb felt it the way you feel a heavy door start to give under the first push. He leaned back in his chair, breathing slow. No rush, no forcing. This connection needed time and patience. Two things he hadn't always had on the battlefield, but ones he was ready to spend here. On the table, Ruth's mug of warm water still sat untouched. Caleb reached for it, feeling the heat seep into his hand. He set it closer to the bed so that when she was ready, all she'd have to do was reach. A simple thing, but to him, it was a way of saying, when you're ready, everything you need will be within reach. The ceiling light flickered once, then steadied. In that brief dim, he caught his own faint reflection in the window, a straight-backed figure, patient, like the long night watches he'd pulled in the service. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with a young soldier in the rain, neither of them speaking, just keeping watch until daylight. Trust back then had started in silences like this. From outside came the far-off sound of a train whistle, rolling past the town and fading. Caleb heard the girl shift again, not opening her eyes. Maybe she was slipping into a thin sleep, maybe just finding a safer position. Either way, he could feel her breathing less strained, like his presence was smoothing the edges of something unseen. He leaned forward to adjust her pillow so her neck wouldn't twist. Careful enough not to wake her, firm enough so it stayed in place. When he pulled his hand back, his eyes lingered on the doll, worn and chipped, but still held tight. Caleb knew that sometimes what keeps a person steady isn't its perfection, but the fact that it's the last piece left from a place that once felt safe. That moment, the look she'd given him, was tucked away now, stored deep like a small map for the road ahead. Because he knew the most fragile things are the ones that need guarding the most. The wind outside eased. Caleb leaned back, closed his eyes for a few seconds, not to rest, but to set the image in place. When he opened them again, he was ready for the long road ahead. A road that started with a single, thin thread, but could be woven into something strong enough to shelter a child. Caleb took the slip of paper from Ruth without a word. Her handwriting leaned just a little, steady and deliberate, like every stroke had been thought through before the pen touched the page. The address was short, just a string of numbers, a street name, and the name of a town. He folded it, slipped it into his coat pocket, and felt the edge press against his chest like a reminder. That afternoon, he drove the old pickup out of the town center. The road narrowed quickly, turning into a rutted strip of dirt pressed between two rows of bare maples. The sky hung low and gray, the air carrying the smell of rotting wood and damp earth. Each turn of the wheels kicked up a few dry leaves, which fell back down and lay still, like they'd never been disturbed. He kept the speed down, partly to dodge the potholes, partly to take in his surroundings. There weren't many houses out here, just a few rusted porch roofs, some yards gone wild, and the occasional leaning street lamp you couldn't be sure still worked. Caleb wondered if, for a kid, this road would feel longer than they could bear, especially on a day with wind cutting across like this. Then he saw it. A white painted house appeared around a bend, the paint peeling in wide patches, showing the weathered gray wood underneath. A fence circled the property in name only, most of it broken, some posts leaning, a few boards lying in the weeds. The gate hung loose, no lock, hinges groaning whenever the wind came through. Caleb pulled off to the side and shut the engine down. The sound of the motor faded, leaving only the wind moving through the bare branches. He sat for a few seconds, looking at the house from this distance. Everything about it seemed built to keep the world out. From the heavy curtains covering every window to the absence of any light inside, even with evening coming on. He opened the truck door and stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The air smelled of damp and mildew, clinging to his skin. Closer in, he started noticing the small things, a cracked step, a dead potted plant left in a corner of the porch, and faint dried mud prints shaped like small feet, leading from the gate to the front door. He stopped at the broken fence, his hand resting on the cold wood. He didn't step through right away. It felt like there was an invisible threshold here, something you needed to think about before crossing. His time in the service brought back a familiar memory, standing in front of an unfamiliar house in a war zone, not knowing exactly what was inside, but certain you were entering ground where you weren't expected. He looked up toward the curtains. Nothing moved, until a vague shadow pressed against the glass, then slipped away just as quick. Caleb had the feeling someone had been looking right at him, weighing him, then retreating. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around his boots. The sky deepened another shade. Caleb pulled the paper from his pocket, checking the address again, more to tell himself than to confirm, yes, this was the place. Every sense he had was sharp now, not from fear, but from the clear understanding that behind the peeling paint and heavy drapes was an answer to more than one thing he didn't yet know. He stood there longer than he needed to, letting the dense quiet of the place settle on him. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet, it was like thin ice over deep winter water, still on the surface, but with something cold and heavy underneath. He drew in a breath, then stepped over the patchy lawn, where moss and weeds tangled together. Each step sank into the soft ground, the sound muffled under his boots. When he reached the porch, one of the boards let out a low groan, almost like a warning. He stopped at the door, his hand brushing the rough paint, feeling the flake and grit of old wood under his fingers. Before knocking, he glanced back, the bare trees closing in behind him, the dirt road darker now. He knew that whether or not the person inside answered, this trip marked something, he'd stepped into a place he wouldn't be able to walk away from easily. And somewhere in the wind circling the porch, he could hear the echo of an old kind of resolve, the kind he'd carried home from years past, now ready to be spent on a different kind of battlefield. Caleb's knock landed 3 times, slow, measured, leaving space between each one long enough to feel the silence in between. He waited, eyes on a thin crack running down the doorframe. Inside, there was the faintest sound, footsteps across a floor, stopping just behind the door. The lock turned, metal grinding like it hadn't moved in a while. The door opened just enough for a face to appear. She was in her early 40s, tall, thin to the point her collarbones pressed sharp against the neck of a gray sweater. Her hair was tied back, a few strands falling across her forehead, not soft but dry and brittle, like there hadn't been time to tend to it. Her eyes went straight to Caleb. They weren't the curious eyes of someone wondering who'd come to the door, and they weren't the guarded look of a stranger on edge. They were flat and smooth, like damp stone in the dark, no cracks, no reaction, just the kind of surface where anything you threw at it would slide right off. Caleb kept it short, told her about the gas station, about the girl. Diane listened without changing her expression. When he finished, she gave the smallest nod, her lips moving just enough to form a thank you. It was clipped, like a period dropped at the end of the first sentence. She didn't ask how the child was, didn't invite him in, didn't wait for more. Her hand stayed on the edge of the door, thin fingers pressing into the wood, ready to close it. Caleb caught the motion and knew he had seconds. He started to speak again, but before he could find the words, Diane stepped back and shut the gap between them. The click of the door shutting rang sharp in the empty air. She didn't lock it, but Caleb felt the invisible line he'd just been pushed back over. He stayed there for a moment, looking at the weathered white paint that had gone dull gray. Behind the heavy curtains, no shadow moved, no sound followed. The quiet was so complete the wind through the fence board sounded far away. He took a breath, the smell of old paint and damp wood clinging to his hands. He knew he'd lost his chance at a straight approach, but the way she shut him out said more than her thank you ever could. He stepped back, scanning the house from the porch. Cracks ran along the window frames, the kind that had been left alone for years. Beside the step sat a pair of small rubber boots, caked with dried mud, leaning against the wall, just enough to conjure an image of rainy days and a child waiting for someone to open the door. Caleb made his way back to the gate, his steps heavier than they'd been coming in. The dirt road ahead stretched long, the bare trees rattling overhead. He opened the truck door but didn't climb in right away. Leaning against the side, he took one more look at the house. The curtains hadn't moved, the door was shut tight, as if the exchange had never happened. Inside him, the small warmth he'd carried from the girl's brief glance at the clinic met the cold wind of this meeting. But instead of going out, it settled deeper, like coals banked under ash. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The rumble broke the quiet around the house. But as he pulled away, he realized he was driving slower than usual. Some part of him was still turned toward that house. Not because of the thin thank you, but because of everything it was trying to hide behind those heavy curtains and that quick closing door, as if afraid a single question might slip inside. And in that moment, Caleb knew this wouldn't be the last time he stopped here. Not because he needed answers right away, but because once he'd seen a fragile thing worth protecting, walking away wasn't in him. The bell over the door jingled as Caleb stepped inside. The air carried that familiar mix you find in small Midwestern stores: cardboard, burnt coffee, sugar, and the faint trace of laundry powder. The wood floor showed dried mud prints, some boards sagging just enough to let out a low groan when walked on. The counter sat by the front window, shelves stacked high behind it with Rooster-branded cereal boxes, dented cans with faded labels, and a bin of potatoes, some already sprouting. On the bulletin board, taped with yellowed strips of masking tape, hung the school bus schedule, a flyer for winter coat donations, and a lost dog notice curling at the edges from damp. Outside, the sky was collapsing fast. To the left of the counter, a pot of black coffee gave off a tired steam. The shopkeeper, a short woman with streaks of gray in her curly hair, apron tied around her waist, was bent over a plastic basket, stacking sugar packets. She looked up at the sound of the bell, her eyes registering an unfamiliar face before slipping back to her task. Caleb paused, letting his eyes adjust to the warm yellow light. He didn't speak right away. Years of patrols had taught him to read a room before opening his mouth. This one said people came for what they needed and left, conversation wasn't the currency here. He poured himself some coffee into a paper cup, drank it black. The scorched taste cut down his throat, steadying without being sharp. He picked up a pack of crackers, a can of chicken soup, and from a discount basket near the door, a dark blue knit cap, thicker than the one on the girl's head, the yarn still holding the smell of dye. He didn't deliberate. Things that mattered weren't things you put off. The woman walked past, arms full of flour bags. Her voice was soft, almost buried in the crinkle of plastic. "Gets dark quick out there." Caleb nodded. She glanced toward the window, set the flour down, rubbed her hands together for warmth. At the counter, she rang up his items without looking up. When her hand reached the knit cap, she froze for a beat, her eyes flicking toward the bulletin board where a flyer read, "Winter Drive, coats, hats, gloves for kids." She didn't comment, just kept ringing. Then she looked at him more closely. Travelin' through? She asked, not curious so much as filling the space. Caleb shook his head. Just passing by. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. A truck roared by outside, dragging a sheet of cold air with it. The bell sounded again when an old man in a ball cap stepped in, bought cigarettes, and stepped out just as fast. Quiet returned. Caleb set his cup down, thumbs circling the lid. The house by the bend, he said, letting the words trail off. He didn't push, didn't frame it as a question. The woman's hand stilled over the cash drawer, as though picking the right word. Finally, she said low, "Kid doesn't go out much, no friends." Her tone was flat, not judging, not dressing it up. Just a line, simple and exact, like reading off a receipt. Caleb nodded. That was all he needed here. He didn't ask why, didn't ask how long. Those questions had their time, but not at the counter of a store where a person had to live through the winter with closed doors and rumors running through a small town market. She slid the crackers into a bag, moving slower now. Sometimes in the afternoons, see her on the steps, she added, eyes still down. Other kids run. She just stands there. Looks like she's waiting. Caleb stayed silent. The picture fixed itself in his mind, a child on a porch, standing still, hands not sure where to go. He remembered the dried mud prints by the door of the White House. The pieces were starting to fit, not by logic but by the instinct of someone who'd learned to listen to silence as information. His eyes drifted to the bulletin board, a library flyer about Saturday Story Hour, a faded sticker advertising free school lunches, a donation box for winter clothes sitting near the register with a handful of coins inside. Caleb pulled out his wallet, slipped in a few bills without counting. The woman looked up, pressed her lips tight, nodded thanks without saying it. "You got family here?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. She nodded again, like it made sense. An unfamiliar truck, heavy boots, the careful way he carried his silence. After a pause, she reached under the counter, brought out a wax paper packet, and slid it toward him. Ginger cookies. Left from last week. Cold like this, better to have something. She spoke more to the wood than to him. Caleb almost refused, but her hand was already gone. He nodded, tucked the cookies into the bag alongside the knit cap. In that moment, he felt the same small spark he'd carried from the gas station, now fed by a simple kindness. Not loud, not enough to fight winter, but like the heat off a cup of coffee, just enough to keep your hands from going numb. And for him, every flicker of warmth came with weight, a duty to guard it. The bell rang again when a gust pressed through the door. The woman held the flyers down with her hand. Caleb helped tape the corners back, his fingers brushing the cheap paper. At the bottom of the Winter Drive flyer, he noticed a child's scrawl, hat, blue. No name. Just a wish. He couldn't say for sure if it belonged to the girl. But suddenly, the blue cap in his bag felt heavier. His resolve, sharpened outside that White House, found its anchor here. If he couldn't open a closed door yet, he could at least prepare for the cold waiting outside it. Watch the road on the bend. Potholes come quick in the dark, she said, her stock farewell. Caleb nodded, paid, and before leaving, dropped another 5 into the donation box. Not because it would fix anything, but because a promise meant more when you sealed it with an act. At the door, he looked back once. The woman had already faded into the shelves, her small frame bent over her work. On the bulletin board, the papers lay flat now, held down by new tape. Outside, the wind groaned long through the trees, like strings scraping together. Caleb stepped into the damp air, the cold cutting at his face. His truck sat under a street lamp, the dull yellow light broken across the hood. He opened the door, set the bag on the passenger seat. The blue hat sat on top, catching the glow. Underneath were the soup and the cookies, small things, but proof he hadn't come empty and wasn't leaving that way either. Before shutting the door, he glanced toward the dirt road leading out of town. The bare branches rattled, making a dry kind of music. Somewhere between those worn houses and broken fences was a porch where a child stood still, waiting. He told himself, if no one else shows up, I will. That thin look she'd given him once had to grow thicker. The engine caught, the sound pushing against the quiet. Caleb drove slow, letting the tires grip over the wet leaves. In the mirror, the store's bulletin board was already gone from view, but the shopkeeper's words lingered, sticking like the burnt smell of the coffee, "Kid doesn't go out, no friends." Not much to go on, but enough to sketch an outline, loneliness you could see, loneliness that had sound. He tightened his grip on the wheel, the leather worn smooth from winters past. The urge to protect, that current that had started back at the gas station, ran broader now, with rhythm and direction. His years had taught him, to keep any bit of joy, however small, you had to be ready to stand against the wind, against locked doors, against words cold as stone. The truck eased out of town, onto the bigger road. Streetlights flickered on one by one under the heavy sky. He didn't turn on the radio. He let the hum of the engine and the rush of the wind ride together, two lines of the same song. On the seat beside him, the blue hat sat quiet but solid, like a promise made real. He thought of the girl facing the wall at the clinic, of that thin thread of a glance, of her hand gripping the cracked doll. And he knew, he'd gone one step further down a road he wouldn't be turning back from. Ahead, the dirt road at the bend waited. At the end of it, the White House still stood, curtains drawn. Caleb exhaled slow, holding back the urge to move too quick. Every fight he'd been in had started with learning the ground, gathering the details, waiting for the right time. This would be no different. And tonight, a corner store, a half-said remark, a blue hat, they'd strung together into something he could hold on to. He pressed the gas. Night rose up, steady, deliberate. Somewhere in that dark was a porch and a child who needed someone to stand for her. And Caleb, with his small bag of supplies, hands that knew how to block the wind, and a silence trained to listen, was ready to take another step, knowing each one now carried the weight of a promise he wouldn't be able to take back. The sky closed in fast, like a door shutting without a sound. Caleb steered the truck around the old block before heading back toward the dirt road that led to the White House. At the far end of a row of low brick buildings, a wooden porch jutted back from the street. A yellow bulb swung overhead, the kind of light you flip on just to see the steps at dusk. An old man sat there in an aluminum folding chair, a worn rubber mat under his boots. He held a chipped enamel mug, one of those freebies that come with discount coffee cans, and sipped from it like he was counting time. Caleb pulled to the curb and killed the engine, not wanting the noise to stir the stillness of the block. The wind carried a mix of wood smoke, wet earth, and rotting leaves. He climbed the porch steps, stopping just far enough back to not crowd the man. The old guy looked up, eyes pale with age but still sharp with the kind of watchfulness you get from spending years looking at the horizon. His knit cap was faded, and a heavy coat with dried mud on the cuffs hung from the chair beside him. Caleb nodded a greeting. The man nodded back, hand still on his cup. Behind him, a wind chime made of shells clicked lightly each time the breeze shifted, a sound thin as pins. Out on the street, a dog trotted by, sniffed a lamp post, then slipped into an alley, its nails tapping the concrete like someone drumming on a tin lid. "Evening," Caleb said, just dropping a pebble into the silence. The old man didn't answer right away. His eyes went past Caleb, down toward the end of the dirt road, where the outline of the White House fence lay dark against the sky. He tapped the mug with his finger 3 times, slow and steady, like a breathing exercise. "You're not from around here," he finally said, voice carrying the stale scent of old coffee clinging to his collar. Caleb nodded. He didn't deny it or explain. That wasn't the point. He followed the man's gaze to the thick curtains of the house, the gate half shut, hinges rusted dark. A few leaves clung to the fence rails, curled tight from the wind. The man raised the cup again, swallowed slow, like he wanted the warmth to last. His hands were rough, nails split the way men's hands get after a lifetime of work. He turned the cup in his fingers, letting the thin steam rise like a reluctant cloud. "Kid doesn't talk much," he said, almost like talking to himself. "Doesn't go out much either." Caleb stayed still. Overhead, the power lines hummed. Dry leaves tumbled across the road. He could hear his own breath pulling slow, steady. The words echoed what the shopkeeper had said, but from a man who sat here every day staring at the same street, they carried a heavier weight. Not gossip. Just facts, like the surface of a stone pressing down. A milk truck rolled past, its dim light stretching shadows across the porch, then snapping them back like an old rubber band. The man waited until the sound faded, then cleared his throat. This time, he looked straight at Caleb. "Her mother passed last year, nobody's seen her smile since." The words landed slow, like a pebble hitting the bottom of a tin basin. No echo, just depth. Caleb didn't look back right away. He set his left hand on his right wrist, a habit he kept from cold nights standing watch. The pulse there felt hotter, half a beat faster. In the service, you learn not to let one sentence knock you off balance. But some sentences, spoken by someone who's been watching day after day, don't rip you open, they eat at you from the inside. Caleb thought of the girl in the clinic, that thin glance, the stretched-out knit hat. He realized then, the absence of a smile weighs more than any cry ever could. The funeral was quiet, the man went on. His eyes drifted back down the street. No music. Not many folks. Paper ran a short piece. I clipped it, stuck it in the calendar. Read it, felt the air on my porch turn colder. Caleb waited. The old man lifted his hand, barely moving it. Since then, now and again, I see her standing on that porch. Holding something, dull maybe, hard to tell. Doesn't look down the street. Just stands there. Long time. Caleb pictured the wooden steps, the dried mud prints he'd noticed earlier. The images overlapped, sharp, no need to underline. He thought of other porches he'd seen, where soldiers waited on rides home, where mothers waited on letters. Porches always sat in the middle, between inside and out, between waiting and giving up. For that kid, maybe the porch was the only place she could stand without being called lost. Goes to the school down the hill, the old man added. Walks. Some mornings, fog still hanging. I go out for the paper, see her pass. Doesn't look left or right, like her eyes might bother someone. Caleb nodded, so faint it barely counted. Wind pushed across the porch. The shells clinked again. Somewhere nearby, a dry twig snapped. Her aunt, the man started, then cut himself short. He backed up, changed it. Folks in that house don't get out much. Once in a while, see her leave early for work. No judgment, no extra words. Like he knew every family carried its own weight. Saying it out loud didn't make it lighter. Caleb didn't press. Small towns had rules. People saw, but they didn't point. That didn't erase truth. It just buried it deeper. Across the street, another porch light flicked on. A woman dropped a trash bag into the bin, her coat brushing plastic with a scratch. The sound was ordinary enough you could believe nothing was wrong. And that's the trouble with ordinary. It hides what's off. The old man raised his mug again, though the coffee had gone cold. He drank anyway, clinging to the routine more than the warmth. I sit here most evenings, he said. Not to watch anyone. Just to know what the day did different. Caleb studied his face, the deep creases at the corners of his eyes carved like plow lines. This man, with his folding chair, enamel cup, and wind chimes, was a marker in town. Not a guidepost, not a judge, just a keeper. Small towns needed men like him to hold the history of a block, when the sparrows stopped landing on the wires, when the bus changed drivers, when a kid stopped smiling. "You kin?" the man asked, not suspicious, just plain. Caleb shook his head. The man hummed, like he'd figured. He shifted, the chair groaning softly. Pulled a sugar packet from his pocket, rolled it between his fingers, then shoved it back where it came from. "Something else," he said suddenly, like it had just come to him. "Fall festival, school had the kids draw pumpkins. They sent the sheets home. Saw hers pinned up at school. Crooked pumpkin, and next to it, a hat. Not a face. Not the teeth. Just a hat on top of the pumpkin. Odd thing." Caleb said nothing. But the picture landed, the stretched knit hat on her head at the clinic. A kid choosing to draw a hat instead of a grin. Choosing cover before smile. He thought of the blue hat sitting in his truck. It felt heavier now. The man turned his cup the other way and fixed Caleb with his eyes, no more sliding off. "So what are you planning to do?" Caleb didn't answer with a strategy. He just said, mostly to himself, "Tonight, I just want to know the road well enough to get back." The man nodded. That was enough. Out here, folks respected an answer that didn't promise much but showed up on time. He reached for his coat, laid it across his knees. His arm shook, then steadied. "Watch out for the dog at 27, he said, like warning about potholes. "Barks after dark. Ain't bitten anyone yet." Caleb almost smiled, just a pull at the corner of his mouth. He nodded thanks. Then he stepped back, leaving the porch to the wind chime. Back in the truck, he didn't start it right away. He sat, counting the porch lights flicking on one by one. At the end of the road, the White House stayed dark. On the porch he'd just left, an old man sipped from a cold cup. And between those 2 points, a child walked to school each morning with a smile buried since last year. He opened the bag, pulled out the blue knit cap, set it on his lap. The yarn was thick, still carrying the scent of dye. He pressed his palm against it, felt the warmth rise. He thought of the thin glance in the clinic, the small hand clutching the cracked doll, the child's scrawl on the donation flyer, hat, blue. Threads connecting, from the store's bulletin board to the white porch steps, from there to the faded clinic walls. Caleb turned the key. Before pulling out, he lowered the window, let the cold slap his face. The sting cleared his head. What mattered now wasn't a promise spoken, it was small, steady acts, each one enough to hold the line. Like the old man's sips of cold coffee, not good, not lasting, but something to keep you through. He rolled forward. Passing the porch, the old man still sat, hand on the mug as if guarding a small flame. Caleb flashed his headlights once. Not a farewell. More like a signal at sea, "I see you out here." The dirt road swallowed the tires, bumps rattling through the frame. On the seat beside him, the blue hat rolled once and settled, finding its place. Caleb's hands tightened on the wheel. The words, "Her mother passed last year, nobody's seen her smile since," sat in his chest, not crushing him, but heavy enough to remind him where he was headed. Night spread, no edges in sight. But this time, in the dark, Caleb could trace the outlines, a porch, a set of steps, thick curtains, a cracked doll's face, a hat waiting to be worn. In the middle of it all, a flicker of joy. Something that only survives if it's sheltered. He'd seen it spark, and now, the need to guard it drove him to hold the wheel steady, no matter the potholes, barking dogs, or doors slamming shut. He wasn't planning to talk much. He was planning to show up. To stay put when needed, and stand between when it counted. At his age, you don't chase noisy fights. You choose the long ones, the kind that give a kid's smile a chance to come back. The county building sat at the head of Main Street, red brick darkened with age, a sun-faded flag snapping against a steel pole every time the wind swept down the valley. Caleb parked in the front row, killed the engine, and sat for a few breaths before heading inside. The lobby smelled like old paper and floor cleaner, the kind of dry mix that clung like dust. A crooked sign listed the office hours. Next to it, a faded photo of the town's high school team hung in a warped frame. The front desk wasn't crowded. A kid in a baseball cap stood there, staring at his shoes, holding a parking ticket. A woman came out hugging a stack of land records, brushing past Caleb with the kind of hurry that said she didn't want to linger. At the far end of the hall was a door marked Sheriff's Office. Inside, radios murmured, a chair squeaked, then silence. Caleb knocked lightly, pushed in when he heard a muffled, "Come in." The office was small, dark wood desk with coffee rings, a county map dotted with thumbtacks, a wall calendar with a moose on it, and a crooked commendation shoved off-center. A heater rattled under the window, blowing out dry warmth. Sheriff Howard sat behind the desk, broad frame, late 50s, hair going gray, shirt collar unbuttoned, old tie hanging loose. His eyes looked like a man who'd read the same reports too many times. Keys jangled on the big leather belt at his waist every time he shifted. Caleb introduced himself quick and got to it. No embellishment, no trimming. Gas station. The girl collapsing. The community clinic. Nurse Ruth. Malnutrition. Dehydration. Signs of neglect. The White House. Broken fence. Heavy curtains. The grocery store. The shopkeeper. Rarely outside. No friends. The old man on the porch. Mother gone last year. Smile gone with her. Howard listened, pen tapping a slow beat on his notebook. He didn't cut in, just glanced up now and then, measuring, then back down. When Caleb finished, the room fell still except for the heater and a burst of static from the radio that died quick. Howard set the pen down, flipped the page like a ritual. His voice was steady, not cold but not warm either. Without evidence of abuse, there's nothing I can do. The words landed like a chipped coin on the desk, not shining, just spinning once and stopping. Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes caught the dried coffee stain on the desk, the tacky ring. He remembered the weightless body he'd caught at the gas station, the cracked lips, the doll clutched tight. No evidence. He'd seen those words stamped in reports before, used to cover holes you could drive a truck through. Howard cleared his throat, pulled the notebook closer. I can order a welfare check. One of my guys knocks on the door, asks a few questions. If something obvious shows, we open a file. Or you call CPS Direct, they'll walk you through the steps, usually. He shrugged, like the words were worn smooth from use. Caleb's eyes went to the county map on the wall, thin dirt roads, bare trees, highlighter marks over patrol routes. He pictured a deputy's knock, a glance through half-closed curtains, the words, "Everything looks fine," scribbled into a report. Trouble that kept quiet never showed up on paper, especially when it wore a coat and knew how to lower its head. You said the nurse mentioned malnutrition, Howard added, eyes back on his notes. You got paperwork? Signed, dated? Not yet, Caleb said, voice even. But I can get it. Howard nodded, satisfied enough. He lifted his coffee, drank, put it back down in the same ring. That's the law. We don't kick down doors without grounds. You see this pile? He gestured to a stack of reports pinned together, thick enough to sag under the clip. Cases stacked high already. Caleb didn't say I understand. Because his understanding was different. Law was a road. Sometimes to walk it, you had to shovel snow first, plant stakes, pace it out against headwind. He stayed put, feeling the carpet press under his boots, reminding him not to move too quick. Howard tilted his head, really looking at Caleb for the first time. His eyes landed on the frayed shoulder of Caleb's coat, dropped to the worn army boots, then back up to a face that carried its years plain. You serve? Caleb nodded. Howard breathed in, let it out with a soft, huh. Not respect, not pity, just the kind of acknowledgement one middle-aged man gives another when no words are needed. I know these kinds of cases, he said, lower now. But knowing doesn't mean acting without a marker to grab onto. You bring me a marker, I'll pull. Caleb looked at Howard's hand, broad, pale, fingers twitching once in a while from coffee or habit. Hands that signed papers more than steered wheels. But that last line, you bring me a marker, I'll pull, was something solid. Not a promise. A mechanism. He nodded, clearer this time. I'll be back. Howard didn't argue. He stood, came around the desk, one hand on the back of his chair like he was steadying it. He slid a business card across, thick stock, corner bent. He scribbled a line on the back. Today's on call. That's the direct line. If you need to log something, call. Just don't during lunch. A half smile, the kind of weary humor men in long jobs use to take the edge off. Caleb pocketed the card. Their handshake was short, firm. Howard's grip was soft-skinned but solid enough, a reminder he wasn't running. He just wouldn't step first without safe ground. In the hall, photos of old academy classes lined the walls, the glass warped with damp. His reflection stretched thin, bent along the curves. In the lobby corner, a bronze plaque listed local men who'd served in wars long past. Caleb stopped, touched one name, felt the cold metal, the smell of brass mixed with disinfectant pulling up memories of barracks mornings. Outside, wind cut over the roofline, flipped leaves wet side up. Caleb dug into his coat pocket, found a half-sharpened pencil, slid it into the spine of a cheap spiral notebook in his truck. Thin, rough paper, but it held ink. He opened to a blank page and wrote the date, the time, then short lines, gas station, 4:20 p.m., girl collapsed, unconscious, cold skin, cracked lips, broken porcelain doll. Clinic, 5:10 p.m., Ruth Miller, RN, malnutrition/dehydration/neglect signs, no doc yet. White House, heavy curtains, broken fence, door shut in 30 seconds. Store, owner. Rarely out, no friends. Porch, old man, mother died last year, no smile since. He wasn't writing to remember, memory had him locked already. He was setting stakes, the markers Howard asked for. Each word a post driven into soft ground. Enough posts could make a fence, and a fence could hold up a door. He stowed the notebook, slid behind the wheel. The blue knit cap still sat in the passenger seat. He laid his hand on it for a moment, then pulled out. In the mirror, the sheriff's door swung shut, the plaque stayed put, the flag still snapped. Nothing had changed except a bent card in his pocket and fresh lines drying on cheap paper. But sometimes, that was the start, one object in its place, one thought pinned down. Caleb drove in silence. The road out of town glowed with wet reflections, yellow light stretched long. Howard's words stayed put, without evidence of abuse, there's nothing I can do. A cold plank across the doorway. Caleb wasn't going to leap it. He was too old to leap. He'd bring a saw. He pictured the steps, back to the clinic, get medical notes, ask Ruth how to phrase a clinical report with teeth, log times when the White House lights went on and off, talk to the teacher at the school down the hill, find the obituary the old man mentioned, clip it, press it flat. Gather fragments not to tell the story himself, but to let their weight speak. His truck passed a small cemetery on the rise, short headstones, faded wreaths, flags in the dirt. He slowed, glanced once, then forward again. Cold crept through the glass, stiffened his hands. But in his chest, a line had tightened, anchored on something ahead. He kept his breathing steady, like wading a current, not fast, not slow, just firm. Near town, he swung by the gas station from that afternoon. The lot was empty, the sign still squeaking in the wind. He sat in the truck, staring at the spot where she'd fallen. Just a dark stain now, maybe rain. No trace left, but he felt it. The starting point of everything now running through him. He pulled the notebook out again, added a line, Sheriff Howard, welfare check if grounds, need medical record, teacher/neighborhood testimony. The period hit like a hammer. He closed the book, slid it into the glove box. Night had settled in full. Windows lit here and there like dots of fire, reminders someone was still awake. Caleb drew in the night air, recognized something he hadn't felt in a while, resolve. Not the kind you burn to win fast, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that accepts time, accepts carrying the weight of nothing we can do, until the weight itself becomes the steps a child can climb without fear. He turned the key. Headlights cut the mist ahead. Somewhere down the dirt road, the White House waited with curtains drawn. Somewhere else, a clinic note waited for a signature. And here, on the seat, a blue hat sat like an unspoken promise. His hands on the wheel, calloused from years of service, had found their ground again. This was his battlefield now, no wire, no gunfire. Just evidence, line by line, until, nothing I can do, stopped being the last word. That night Caleb didn't head straight back to the motel. He pulled into the empty lot by the wooden bridge that crossed the creek behind town. The water moved slow, the moon laying silver across it like scratched glass. He sat there with the truck door cracked open so he could hear the stream, the cool damp air drifting in. In his hand was the sheriff's business card, corner bent. He kept turning it over, felt heavier than a scrap of paper ought to. He scrolled through his phone contacts. Names he hadn't touched since leaving the service. Most of them meant nothing now. He stopped at one, Sarah Mitchell. She used to work child welfare in the next state over, later moved into counseling at a school. He couldn't remember the last time they spoke. A year? More. But of all the faded names, Sarah was the only one he trusted to understand without a whole lot of explaining. He hit call. The ring dragged. 3 times. 4. Then a woman's voice came through, husky, tired, but sharp underneath. Caleb. Jesus, it's been a while. He took a breath, settled himself before answering. Then he told it straight, clipped and steady, like a field report. The gas station. The girl going down. The clinic, Ruth's words. The White House, the aunt's cold stare. Sheriff Howard and his line, no evidence, no case. On the other end, silence. Papers shuffled. She was still at the office, probably under a stack of files. When she spoke again, her voice dropped, softer, like she didn't want to wake anyone. Caleb, you can't push this through the system, not yet. You know that. He gave a low, yeah. Sarah went on. If you really want to help, the first thing is, don't become just another shadow in that kid's life. Let her trust you. When she does, she'll give you what you need, a word, a note, maybe just a look. That's living evidence. Everything else is paperwork. Caleb leaned his head back, eyes shut. Her words sank slow, like water into dry ground. He'd been trained to think every mission needed a plan, a clear target. But with a child, the only thing that counted as proof might be that thin thread of trust. Sarah paused, then added. And one more thing. Don't go making promises. Kids like that, they've had enough broken ones already. Promises shatter easy. What matters is you showing up. Regular. Not leaving when she looks around. Believe me, sometimes that does more than any official report. They hung up without the polite goodbyes. Caleb stared at the dark screen, her voice still echoing in his ear. He stayed put, listening to the creak, replaying the moment the girl had glanced at him in the clinic. Just a flicker, a thread, but Sarah had named it. That was the start. He thought about the days ahead, not as a fight to win but as a watch to stand, patient, steady, eyes on the door. The moon slid down, sky turning blacker. Caleb shut the truck door and started the engine. Before pulling out, he opened his notebook and wrote under the earlier notes, "Trust. Don't push. Don't promise. Just show up." The truck rolled forward, leaving behind the bridge and the sound of water. Ahead, the night road stretched, dotted with tired yellow lights like waypoints. And in his chest, something firmed up. He wasn't going to find evidence by knocking harder. He'd find it by staying long enough for the door to open from the inside. Morning came down on the town like a damp washcloth, thin, wet, seeping through the collar. Caleb was up earlier than usual. He brewed coffee in a chipped enamel mug, drank it standing, lights off. By the time the sky had just started to gray, he was already driving out of the motel lot, heading along the road at the base of the hill toward the street with the white-painted house. Dew streaked his windshield, the wipers dragging across and leaving faint smudges like pencil marks that wouldn't dry. He parked a few houses down from the broken fence, cut the engine. In the silence, the dash clock ticked sharp and dry. On the seat beside him sat the dark blue knit cap from the store last night, with the can of soup and the pack of ginger cookies still unopened. He laid his palm on the thick wool, soaking up the warmth, then slipped it into his coat pocket. The rough fabric against his skin felt like a reminder carved in, "Don't come empty-handed, don't leave empty-handed." The light spread slow. Rooflines came clear. People out early let their breath hang like smoke. From down the road came the squeal of the school bus brakes, coughing like an old man's lungs. Caleb sat still, eyes on the front yard of the White House. The heavy curtains stayed drawn. The fence still leaned, like a sentence left unfinished. He wasn't waiting on hope, just on rhythm. A starling landed on the power line, flapped once, gave a short call, then took off. Fog slid over the porch, clinging to the cracked steps. Everything looked the same as yesterday, the same as most mornings this time of year. Until, just after the bus noise died away, the front door eased open. First a sliver of light, then the small outline of a girl stepping out, careful not to let the door creak. Mia. Coat too thin, buttoned crooked. Hair tied quick, strands stuck to her cheek. In her arms, the cracked porcelain doll. And a folded piece of paper, edges crumpled from damp. She stood a beat on the porch. Not darting looks, not overly shy. Just the stance of someone who knew the porch better than the gate. Caleb opened his truck door, got out, but kept distance. He didn't call, didn't wave. Hurry was the easiest way to spook the air. He walked along the edge of the road, slow and steady, like patrolling a narrow canal bank. Mia stepped down, made her way along the damp grass to the gate. Each step left a faint mark, fading as the water soaked in. She didn't lift her head until she reached the gate. When her small hands pushed it open, the hinge gave a thin squeal, like a sore tooth. Caleb stopped just outside, close enough for a smile that didn't need to spread wide, a greeting that didn't need words. She hugged the doll tight, paper pressed between hand and coat. Her eyes stayed down, then lifted a little, just enough to catch him. It wasn't the quick threadbare glance from the clinic. It held for half a beat, long enough for a choice. Caleb slipped one hand out of his coat pocket, bare skin catching the damp. He gave a small nod, the kind meant to calm something that wanted to bolt, and didn't add a move. Mia opened her left hand. The paper showed, nail marks pressed into the edge like she'd held it all night. She stepped closer, just enough that the brush of her coat could be heard. "No, hello. No, how are you?" Just lifted it toward him, her hand trembling a hairline. "Keep this for me." 4 words fell with no sound. They landed in the dirt, the cold, the ache that hung in the morning. Caleb took it, his thumb brushing the damp edge. The chill traced across his fingertip like someone drawing a line with creek water. He didn't open it. He folded it deeper into his palm, like opening it too soon might scatter what she'd just placed there. Mia stepped back half a pace, clutching the doll tighter, the instinct of someone who's just given something else away. The doll's cracked face caught the gray light, flashing like a scar. She watched the paper disappear into his hand, calmer than he was. Not the calm of someone grown, but the way a child shields herself. Keep it playing, no need to explain. In that moment, a quiet joy flickered in Caleb, like a coal hidden in ash, small, private, real. Not because he'd convinced anyone, but because a child had done what most adults can't, chosen one person to hand off the lightest, heaviest load. And with it came the old reflex, protect. His whole body, from heartbeat to footing, took on extra weight, the weight of holding something fragile. He slipped the paper into the inside pocket where he kept his notebook and Howard's card. Against his chest, it crackled faint under the coat. The sound steadied him, like checking the lock before leaving the house. He pulled the knit cap from his coat. He didn't hold it out like a gift. He set it on top of the fence post between them, within her reach, no extra steps. The wool drank the fog, turning a deeper shade of blue. Mia eyed it. She didn't grab. Her gaze flicked to the porch, then back. Lips pressed tight, doll shifted to free her hand. She touched the wool with one fingertip, felt the coarse knit, and her shoulders eased. She took it, turned it in her hand, then pulled it over her head. A little big, covering half her ears. The way she tugged it down was the same motion Caleb had made at the clinic, only this time, she did it herself. To Caleb, that small move was its own kind of yes. Not yes to him, but to the promise of warmth. He saw her ears no longer red, her grip on the doll not as white from the cold. The little details fit together into a picture clear enough. He was standing in the right place on the right morning. Behind her, the door shuddered, maybe someone moving inside, maybe the wind. She tilted her head slightly, the reflex of a kid who's learned to listen to the house before deciding how long to stay outside. Caleb caught it. He didn't linger. He nodded, pressed the pocket flat against his chest one more time, like signing an invisible form. Mia hugged the doll and looked up, this time directly. No smile. But her eyes weren't as clouded as they had been in the clinic. At the bottom of them was a quiet shine, like morning light in a raindrop on the fence, small, easy to miss, but there. Caleb stepped back, giving space. She nodded, barely, turned, pushed the gate. The hinge squealed again. She crossed the yard, mud sticking to her heels. At the porch she paused, tugged the hat once more, then slipped inside. The door closed, no slam, no lock, just wood drifting into frame like a cloud across the sky. He stood outside, his hand holding the folded paper like a fistful of dry soil. The damp sank through his collar. Cold bit. But inside his chest, something else warmed, resolve. Not the kind that charges forward, but the kind that keeps a man standing his ground. He stared at the curtained window, imagined the table, the chairs, the footsteps, the shadows moving past. None of that belonged to him. What did was this paper in his pocket, that hat on her head, and the road he'd have to walk to turn those small things into markers the law couldn't ignore. Back at his truck, he sat without starting the engine. He pulled the paper out, felt it again, the cheap stock, the creased corner, the smell of damp. He didn't open it. Things had to go in order, hold, breathe, read. He tucked it back into the inside pocket, pulled his coat closed, then turned the key. The engine caught soft. In the rear view, the fence leaned, the hat's blue just barely visible through a slit in the curtain, or maybe only in his wanting. He didn't stay to be sure. He turned the wheel, rolled toward the main road. Morning unwrapped layer by layer, the paperboy tossing an orange-wrapped bundle onto a yard, a man splashing hot water on his steps to melt ice. Another kid running hard to catch a bus already pulling away. Inside all those layers, Caleb carried his own, 4 words handed over in trust, a cap that found the right head, and the distance between porch and gate shortened by one small choice. He drove past the gas station. The patch of brick where she'd collapsed was drying in the early sun. He looked once, like nodding to the starting point of a promise. Up ahead, the sign for town hall showed through the thinning fog. He knew where he'd stop next, the office that smelled of paper and disinfectant, with the coffee-stained desk and the man who'd said, "Give me a marker, I'll pull." And now, in his pocket, was a marker heavier than any piece of metal. He gripped the wheel, steady in his lane. No music, no rush. The quiet inside the cab did its job, guarding a damp slip of paper, keeping warm the resolve just lit. Outside, the light gathered. The town's day began in its slow, wordless way. For Caleb, it began with holding on. Holding the paper, holding the small flame of trust, holding his silent vow to stand here as long as needed. Because some things only survive if someone's willing to shield them. And this morning, a child had trusted him with that job. Caleb pulled into the small lot behind the town library. Morning wind moved through the open space, carrying the smell of wet leaves and last night's rain. He sat still, both hands resting on the wheel for a long while before he finally reached into his inside pocket. The little note was there, creased, damp, fragile. His rough fingers smoothed it gently, working the folds out. He drew in a breath, held it the way he used to before squeezing a trigger. Then he opened it. 6 words, scrawled, uneven. "This isn't a home." A draft slipped through the cracked window and caught the paper, lifting the edge like it wanted to carry it away. Caleb set his hand down heavy to keep it there. 6 words, short as they were, dropped on his chest like a stone from high up, pressing through the fabric, through the skin, straight onto all the cracks already inside him. He leaned back, eyes shut tight. In his head he could hear the steady weight of boots from years ago, patient, relentless. He remembered kids in a refugee camp scribbling on a stained wall, "Want to go home." But this was different. This was here, in America, in a town with a church, a school, a corner store. And still, an 8-year-old had to put down in shaky handwriting the thing no adult would say out loud. Caleb lifted his head, looked through the windshield. The town rolled on as usual, a woman walking her dog, an old man folding his paper on the porch. No one heard the faint pulse of that note in his hand. No one saw the eyes of the child who'd written it. He folded the paper again, careful now, and tucked it into his notebook. On the page beside it he wrote the date, the time, the spot, like logging a scene. From here on, it wasn't just his gut telling him. He had something concrete, something that could stand. But beyond evidence, he knew what it really was, a fragile trust. A small hand had chosen him to carry the only thing it could write. He got out of the truck, let the wind sting his face. Walked a circle through the lot, pulling the morning air deep just to clear his head. Inside him, joy and pain tangled tight, joy that she'd finally broken her silence, pain that 6 words like that had to come from a kid at all. Back in the cab, he fired up the engine. In the mirror, the White House floated through the fog. It had just been named, plain and simple, "This isn't a home." Not with a hammer blow, not an accusation. Just a shaky line of ink. Caleb's grip locked on the wheel, knuckles white. He whispered, almost soundless, "That's enough." Resolve rose in him, quiet, but solid. No more waiting, no more hoping some office would conjure a miracle. 6 words had laid the job square in his hands, protect. The small lift he'd felt watching her pull that cap down this morning, the trust that had just cracked open, were now tied to a vow he couldn't back away from. He dropped it in gear, rolled out toward the main road. The paper rode in his pocket, rustling with every bump, like it was breathing for her. Caleb kept his speed steady, not fast, not slow. He knew from this morning forward, he'd stepped into a different kind of fight, a fight without rifles or maps, where 6 small words were the only flag to follow. And he was ready. That noon, the sun pushed through thin gray clouds, broken up like an old, worn field jacket. Caleb sat in his truck outside Ruth's small clinic. On the passenger seat, the slip of paper with 6 shaky words was tucked inside his notebook, edges curled from how tight he'd kept it. He looked at it once more, took a long breath, then went in. The place was quiet, just the clock ticking on the wall and the sharp smell of disinfectant. Ruth was setting pill packs on a tray, her gray hair tied back neat. When she saw Caleb, she only nodded. Her eyes had already seen enough stories to know one when it arrived. He opened the notebook and laid the slip down in front of her. She slid on her glasses, leaned in. The 6 uneven words showed plain under the fluorescent light. Ruth didn't speak right away. She just breathed out, closed the notebook gently. A moment later, she said, steady and low. Kid needs someplace else. If she stays, she'll wither. Caleb gave a slow nod. Her words weren't loud, but they stuck like a nail. Ruth pulled out a blank page, wrote down the basics, time, medical notes, signs of malnutrition, and ended with one line, clear signs of neglect. Her handwriting was strong and straight, nothing like the shaky scrawl from Mia. That difference alone made the record matter. He left the clinic with the report in hand. By afternoon, the light was fading as he pulled into the elementary school lot. The yard was empty, leaves chasing each other in the wind. Inside, in the front office, Marion was stacking papers. The room smelled of chalk dust and copy paper. Caleb set the notebook down, opened it. Mia's slip sat there again, this time not trembling in the air but flat, steady on the desk. Marion read it, her hand drifting to her chest. Silence stretched out, broken only by leaves scratching at the window. Then she spoke, almost echoing Ruth's words, soft but certain. She needs someplace else. She flipped over the back of an old test sheet, wrote a note in her slanted hand, student often withdrawn, avoids contact. Once drew a family picture with only herself and a soldier. No mention of current guardian. At the end, she signed her name, set the pen down without shaking. Caleb looked at the page and felt like stones were finally lining up into a path. No shouting, no big noise, just small voices, steady as a drumbeat out in the woods, keeping a soldier from losing his way. By the time he left the school, the sun had dropped low, burning orange against the gray sky. He slipped everything into a folder, pressed it close against his chest. Driving back along the dirt road, the wind carried in the smell of burnt leaves somewhere nearby. He didn't speak, but one thought kept repeating in him, Mia won't have to write another note like that again. His grip tightened on the wheel, eyes fixed on the brick courthouse rising ahead. The decision was set. Mia's shaky letters, Ruth's steady report, Marion's careful words, they had become one voice. And Caleb knew he was the one who had to carry that voice where it needed to be heard. The town's courtroom was small, tucked on the second floor with a low ceiling and walls painted a yellow that had faded into the color of old honey. Wooden benches lined the space, carrying the smell of paper and plaster dust. Caleb sat quietly, one hand on the thin folder he'd pulled together over days. Just a scrap of paper with 6 words, Ruth's statement, and the teacher Marion's report. Not much on its own, but for him, it was a whole campaign. The judge, gray-haired and hoarse, read each line slowly. The sound of pages turning carried louder than the ceiling fan's squeak. Across from him, Diane sat upright, her hands folded tight. She wasn't angry, not outwardly. Her face was as flat and cold as the day she first opened the door. When asked, she kept it brief, I raised her. She has a roof, a bed. No abuse. The judge lifted his eyes to Caleb, studying him. Caleb didn't give a long speech. He simply set the small piece of paper on the desk, letting those 6 uneven words speak for themselves. The room went still. A draft slipped through the door crack, stirring the edge of the paper, as if echoing Mia's breath when she first handed it to him. Finally, the judge spoke, slow and firm, we'll allow Mr. Caleb to take the child on weekends, for now. Custody remains unchanged, but we'll need a closer look at her living situation. The gavel came down, sharp and final. Diane rose. She didn't slam the table or raise her voice. She just gave Caleb a long look, her eyes dark and stagnant like water that never moves. Then, dry as stone, she said, "Don't make this harder for her." Her words fell heavy, not echoing but sinking, like a rock dropped into deep water. They left ripples in Caleb's chest. He didn't answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because sometimes silence is the only way to hold on to what matters. He stepped out into the evening. The courthouse steps were stained with the last of the sunset, the gray bricks dampening with early dew. Caleb walked down, folder pressed against his chest. What he felt wasn't triumph but something quieter, like a small flame cupped against the wind. Fragile, but enough to light the way toward the weekend. Driving home, he pictured Mia stepping out through a white picket fence, clutching her cracked doll, waiting for him. The image made his grip on the wheel tighten. He knew this was just the beginning. But in a town full of closed doors, at last, a sliver of light had opened for that child to step through. He drove slow, listening to the hum of the engine blend with the night air. Inside, a new rhythm of resolve carried him forward. This weekend, he would give Mia a place free of tension, a roof that might not be permanent but would be safe. From there, step by step, he'd protect the fragile thing he'd just been handed. Caleb's wooden house sat on the slope, its long porch made from old pine boards. On that first weekend morning, he brought Mia there. The road climbed gently, with thinning woods on both sides, leaves already fallen, opening patches of pale blue sky. The house wasn't big, but it was clean, carrying the smell of cedar and wood smoke. Mia stepped over the threshold, clutching her doll tight against her chest. She didn't ask questions, didn't run off to explore like most kids would. She just sat down on the porch step, leaned her back against a post, and stared out toward the wide valley below. Caleb let the silence be. He didn't fill it with questions or fuss. Out back, he split some logs, the steady thud of the axe echoing like a slow, patient heartbeat. By late morning, the sun spread gold across the valley. Mia was still in the same spot, holding her doll close, her eyes distant, like she was standing guard. Caleb carried out a cup of hot cocoa and set it beside her without saying a word. The steam drifted up into the cold air. When he looked back a while later, the cup was half empty. "No, thank you," but the small lip print on the rim said enough. At noon, he laid out bread and vegetable soup. She ate slowly, one spoonful at a time, her eyes still slipping now and then toward the horizon, like she was keeping watch. Caleb let the sound of the spoon against the bowl carry the moment. By afternoon, the wind from the valley swept up to the porch, spinning dry leaves around their feet. The porch groaned like it was tired too. Caleb sat on an old chair, cleaning his pocketknife, his eyes never resting on Mia too long but always catching her in the corner of his sight. She was still there, just as she'd been all day, but something had shifted. The doll was no longer clutched tight to her chest. It rested on her lap now, her small hand loose, as if she was testing the idea that maybe she didn't have to hold on so hard here. When dusk stretched shadows across the slope, Caleb lit a small fire by the porch. The glow touched her face, softening those faraway eyes. For a moment, he didn't see a neglected child. He saw someone learning how to breathe easy again. Night settled in. The fire's warmth lingered. Mia leaned her head against the wooden post, eyelids heavy. Caleb pulled a blanket over her shoulders and sat beside her, both of them looking out at the dark valley. No words needed. That silence was enough, like the first bridge to a home, not made of bricks or papers, but of simply being there and not walking away. Evening settled in, the last streaks of orange fading off the ridge and giving way to a deep shade of purple. The damp air drifted up from the valley, slipping through the cracks of the porch, making the fire in the stove flicker like it might die, then flare again. Caleb walked back into the kitchen, pulled 2 chipped enamel mugs off the shelf, and filled them with hot cocoa. The steam rose, mixing with the smell of burning wood, carrying a quiet kind of warmth, like a hand resting on your shoulder. He brought them out to the porch. Mia was still in the same spot, her head leaning against the post, her eyes heavy with sleep. When he set the cup down in front of her, she touched the warm rim, blinking as if to make sure this wasn't just a dream. They sat there in silence, the night filled only with the buzz of crickets somewhere in the grass. Caleb took a sip, let the bittersweet taste settle in his throat. Then, from beside him, came a voice so soft it was almost breath. Mom said, "If someone keeps my dolls safe while I sleep, that's home." The words were fragile, like a thread the wind might snap, but they landed square in Caleb's ears. He looked over. In Mia's arms, the cracked porcelain doll rested, its head patched back together with a thin line of glue. The girl's eyes stayed fixed on it, as if handing over her whole world. Caleb didn't answer right away. He set his cup down and placed his hand gently over the doll. His hand, broad and weathered, covered the fragile thing like a shield. His eyes met Mia's, and he gave a small nod. No words. Just that one motion, and it was enough, a promise without needing to be spoken. Mia closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed into rhythm. The doll stayed under his hand, its frayed dress stirring with the breeze. Caleb kept his hand there, steady, like a soldier standing guard, knowing peace only lasts if someone is willing to stay awake for it. For a moment, memories pulled him back, nights in the desert, his buddies asleep while he kept watch on the horizon. The sounds, the air, all of it was different now, but the job was the same, hold the line so someone else could rest. The wind swept across the porch, carrying the smell of damp earth and dry leaves. The fire burned down to nothing, leaving only a pale crescent moon climbing over the hill. Caleb sat straight, his hand still resting on the doll, his eyes fixed on the dark ahead. He wasn't thinking about tomorrow, about court, or about Diane. Just the steady breath beside him, and the fragile trust that had just been placed in his care. In that quiet, something simple came to him: a home doesn't need sturdy walls or a high roof. It just needs someone willing to guard another's sleep. And that night, he had taken that role, not with grand vows, but with a hand resting on the worn-out toy of a little girl. A winter afternoon settled over the valley, painted in a pale gray. It was so quiet that the crack of an axe splitting wood carried sharp and dry, each strike echoing like slow knocks against the cold, heavy air. Caleb stood in the yard, shoulders wrapped in a thick coat, every swing sending up a small cloud of white breath. The wood split clean, chips scattering and falling with a steady rustle to the frozen ground. From the doorway came the groan of an old hinge. Mia stepped out, small in her worn coat, the heels of her shoes rubbed down and dusted. In her hands was the porcelain doll he knew so well. The one she used to cling to as if it were air itself. She didn't call his name, didn't move toward him. Instead, she walked slowly to the porch, set the doll carefully on the step, and turned back inside. No words. No glance. Just one simple act, neat and quiet, like a signal only the man out in the yard would understand. Caleb froze mid-swing, the axe still buried in the block of wood. He lifted his head and watched her disappear behind the door. The wooden panel shut softly, no sound at all. Only the doll remained on the step, its faded dress and cracked face resting in the winter light. He walked over, the north wind tugging at his coat, carrying the dry scent of pine and distant chimney smoke. Bending down, he picked up the doll with both hands, not like a toy, but like a flag passed from one set of hands to another in the middle of a fight. In that moment, he understood. Mia didn't need to hold on to it anymore to keep herself steady. She had given it to him and gone inside with empty hands. It wasn't surrender, it was trust. A quiet message, stronger than anything she could have said. Caleb sat down on the porch step, the doll resting in his palms. The late winter sun pushed through thin clouds, breaking into red light across the roofline. Inside, he could hear the faint pop of firewood, knowing she was settled somewhere, not needing to look out. His fingers closed gently around the doll. The cold bit into his skin, but something warmer stirred in his chest, the same feeling you get when a buddy turns his back in the trench, trusting you to watch it. A small kind of joy broke through, not loud, not bright, but enough to ease the weight on his shoulders. He placed the doll on the living room windowsill, where the light could reach it. Then he turned back to the yard, gripped the axe, and finished the swing he'd left hanging. Each strike after that wasn't just about splitting firewood. It was about carving a promise into the cold air, to protect what had just been placed in his hands, until it could stand strong on its own against the winter wind. Caleb stood there, his hand still carrying the cold from the porcelain doll, his breath drifting out in slow white clouds into the winter air. The sky was closing in, heavy with clouds, and the valley below was nothing but shifting gray shadows. He didn't move right away. It felt like if he stepped forward, the moment he had just lived might break apart. In the silence, he slowly realized something. The girl had placed her idea of home here, not in words, not in the direct way children sometimes speak, but in a small act that felt like the period at the end of a diary entry. The doll wasn't clutched in her shaking arms anymore, it was resting on the wooden step of his house. And in the fragile world of a child, that meant more than any promise spoken out loud. He walked back inside, passing the window where the doll now lay. A faint yellow light spilled over it, giving the worn thing a softer look. Caleb let his hand rest against the window frame, as if to confirm that it wasn't just the doll, the girl herself had left a piece of trust behind. In the kitchen, the smell of plain chicken soup filled the air, mixing with the scent of burning wood. Mia sat at the table, her hands woven together, her eyes lowered, tracing the scratches on the wood as if they were lines to be read. She didn't ask about the doll. She didn't even mention it. But the fact that she sat there empty-handed, holding nothing, was enough for Caleb to understand. He tossed another log into the fire, letting the flames rise higher. It was his quiet way of answering, this house would hold its warmth. When night finally settled, he stepped back onto the porch. The valley was swallowed in darkness, except for a few lonely lights scattered from distant farms. He stood still, chest filling with the sharp cold air, watching his breath vanish into nothing. But this time, instead of that old emptiness he knew so well, something else rose inside him, a steady resolve. To protect that little piece of trust she had laid down here. He remembered the long nights on guard, every breath tight with the thought of what might be waiting in the dark. But now, each breath felt like a vow. This house wasn't going to be just a stopover. That child had put her home here, and he, someone who once swore never to leave anyone behind, would hold fast to that. The wind still cut across the porch, but it didn't carry only cold anymore. Somewhere in his chest, a different kind of fire had been lit, quiet, steady, and strong enough to guide both him and the girl through the long winter ahead. Night settled over the valley like a heavy, muffled blanket. On the wooden porch, the old bulb hanging from the ceiling threw a small circle of yellow light into a sea of darkness. Inside, the fire in the stove crackled steady, the wood popping now and then like the quiet heartbeat of a home. The smell of baked bread drifted through the room, warm and sweet, mixing with the sharp scent of burning pine. Caleb breathed it in, surprised at the gentleness of it. He remembered too well the nights on base, gunpowder in the air, hot sand, the chop of helicopter blades cutting the sky. This was the opposite of all that. This was soft, forgiving, like time itself had decided to ease up on him for a while. Mia sat at the low wooden table, a small lamp beside her, its glow spilling across her face. In her hands was a thin picture book, edges worn from use. Her eyes moved over the pages, calm and steady, sometimes furrowing as if she was puzzling out a detail. The doll was no longer clutched against her chest, it sat on the window ledge, a silent witness to how things were changing. Caleb sat in a chair by the fire, his hand resting on his knee. He wasn't reading, wasn't doing much of anything. Just watching. It felt like every detail in that room needed to be etched into memory, the turn of a page, the snap of the firewood, the wind brushing against the siding outside. Together they formed a kind of quiet song. Every now and then, Mia looked up and met his eyes. No words passed between them, but there was enough in that look, calm, steady, that talking wasn't necessary. She always turned back to her book, shoulders rising and falling with each even breath. On the table, a plate held a few crumbs of bread. Caleb brushed them into his hand and dropped them onto the larger dish. A small motion, almost nothing, but it carried the rhythm of a life he'd missed, ordinary, steady, the kind of thing he used to dream about when he was half a world away. Not the battles, not the noise, just the sound of a spoon against a plate, the smell of bread, the peace in a child's eyes. A gust worked its way through the cracks of the door, and the fire jumped. Caleb rose, added another log, then eased back into his chair. By then Mia had closed the book and leaned back, her eyes slipping shut. The lamp's glow fell soft across her, like a hand resting gently on her forehead. He pulled a thin blanket over her shoulders, careful not to wake her, and sat again in the quiet. The night outside was still dark and thick. But inside that small circle of light, he could feel something solid taking shape. A bit of peace, built piece by piece, not through promises but through simple presence, through care. And in the stillness of that winter night, Caleb knew one thing for sure, this place, now, could finally be called home. The night had settled in deep, nothing but the wind whistling through the ridge and the soft crackle of the fire. In the small room, a warm lamp spilled its light over the girl's thin shoulders. She'd fallen asleep at the table, the book slipping from her hand, the page half closed like a quiet breath. The old doll sat on the windowsill, still as a seal no one could break. Caleb sat a few steps away, back straight, hands folded, eyes steady, like he was still on watch. There was no battlefield here, no sirens, no enemy. But inside him, that sense of keeping guard hadn't left. All he wanted was to make sure a child's sleep stayed untouched. He thought of the desert, of buddies handing off small things, a photo, a tag, with the same words, "Keep this for me." Back then, he never imagined a day when a child would hand him the most fragile thing she had. Not to hold for a while, but to trust completely. Outside, the rain tapped steady against the tin roof. Caleb lifted his eyes to the doll on the sill. It wasn't just a toy anymore. It was a small flag planted in the silence, saying this place was now a refuge. He nodded to himself, as if to answer, "I understand." Tomorrow would come with its share of paperwork, stairs, and worries he couldn't name yet. But for now, in this cabin tucked on the slope, all that mattered was being present. No promises, no big words, just staying put, long enough and steady enough, so the child didn't have to cling to a breakable thing like it was her last lifeline. The fire dimmed, embers glowing weak before fading. Caleb rose and stepped onto the porch. His breath turned white in the cold rain. The valley stretched dark, but behind him the small lamp still shone, throwing out a thin, stubborn warmth against the winter wind. He looked back once more, the girl asleep, hand loose at her side, her face soft, as if she'd finally found a place where she didn't have to be on guard. And then, a voice, quiet, almost more thought than sound, seemed to speak for him. If a child placed her most precious thing in your care, would you have the courage to keep it safe, just by staying? That question drifted with the rain, pressing into the hearts of grown folks, those who knew loss, who'd been left behind. A reminder that kindness doesn't always look grand. Sometimes it's just staying. Sometimes it's not turning away. And that night, in the little wooden house, a soldier knew better than ever, the hardest battle wasn't against the world outside, it was learning how to hold peace steady, so a child could believe she finally had a home. When the fire fades to embers and the world feels cold, sometimes all that matters is knowing someone stayed. No promises, no speeches, just being there. If you've ever carried that kind of trust, leave a line below. A word, a memory, even a nod, so we remember we still have small fires to share.